Hey everybody, in this video we're going to go over how to graph the sine function. Now notice that we're starting with the unit circle, and that's really the basis for where this comes from, because what we're going to do is we're going to start with the idea that we dealt with in a previous video about how do we find the trig ratio of an angle given a point. Because the key thing with the unit circle are these points. And that is, for a given angle, it passes through the point that it says. And so the way we worked sine is we said sine of an angle, which we'll call x, is equal to the y value divided by the distance from 0, or from the origin. Now, in the unit circle, this becomes actually a little bit easier, because if you notice, the radius is 1 at all these points, and since it's a circle, the distance for all of these points, whether they're on the axis or not, is 1. So that means the sine ratio is actually a little bit simpler. Sine of x is just the y value. Now again, x in this case is whatever angle we're plugging in. So if we want to figure out what the sine graph looks like, we have to remember that we're plugging in angles. So that's how our x-axis is labeled. So let's start at the origin with an angle of 0. So at an angle of 0, we have a y value of 0. So I'll put a point right there at the origin. We have an angle of 0, and we have a y value of 0. So our next angle is pi over 6. And so when we look back at the unit circle, at pi over 6, we have a sine ratio, that is the y value, of 1/2. The next value, the next angle, is pi over 3. And so pi over 3 has a y value of square root of 3 over 2. Now square root of 3 over 2, well, that's bigger than 0.5 and it's less than 1. So it's somewhere about there. And then at pi over 2 on our unit circle, we have a y value of 1. So now we've got this much of our graph for our sine function plotted. So the next angle is 2 pi over 3, and that has a y value of square root of 3 over 2, which is the same as this point. So I just draw this over here so that it's on the same level. And then for 5 pi over 6 on our unit circle, that has a y value of 1/2. And then pi, on our unit circle, that has a y value of 0. So this covers all the sine ratios from 0 all the way to pi. And so that covers the first half of the unit circle that's above the x-axis, but then we keep going on. So our next angle is 7 pi over 6, and that has a sine ratio of -1/2. And then our next angle, 4 pi over 3, has a sine ratio of -3 over 2. And then our next angle, 3 pi over 2, that has a y value of -1. At 5 pi over 3, we have a y value of -3 over 2. At 11 pi over 6, we have -1/2. And then at 2 pi, we have a ratio of 0. And so here is what our function looks like. But notice that we have a few extra points that we could fill in. And so on this end, we have 13 pi over 6. Now, that angle doesn't show up on the unit circle, so where would that be? Well, each of these increments, if you notice, are in increments of pi over 6. So basically, this is just pi over 6 past 2 pi. So if we think about 2 pi being here, where's pi over 6 past that? It's right there. This is the same as pi over 6. So at 13 pi over 6, we would again have a ratio of 1/2. So let's plug that point right there. Now negative pi over 6 is not shown on the unit circle, but a negative angle is just the same rotation, just in the opposite direction. So here's pi over 6, so negative pi over 6 is down here. Same as 11 pi over 6. And so that gives us a ratio of -1/2. And the same thing for negative pi over 3. We look at positive pi over 3, it's up here, and so we rotate in the opposite direction to right here, to 5 pi over 3. And that gives us a ratio of negative radical 3 over 2. So that's going to be somewhere about there. And so here is what our sine graph looks like if we connect all of these points. Again, we're just tracing the y value as it goes around the unit circle. And that's where this graph comes from. Thanks for watching. Hope it helped. If you want to see more videos like this, click the subscribe button. If you have suggestions or problems you want to see worked out, type a comment below. To support the channel, click the Patreon link to help keep this going. Thanks so much for watching, and remember, the best way to understand something is to do it.